This video is sponsored by Cricut. In this video, I'm going to be creating my own version of Anthropologie's fish-scaled Pisces furniture collection on this $25 thrifted dresser with the help of my Cricut Maker 3. Welcome back to my channel. Katie here from Salvaged by K. Scott. I get inspiration for my furniture flips from all over the place, but one website that I make sure and check on a regular basis is Anthropologie.com. And as soon as I saw their fish-scaled Pisces furniture collection, I knew I had to try and recreate that look for myself. I love picking up these flat-fronted mid-century modern pieces because they're the perfect shell or frame for getting really creative. They aren't precious antiques or super high quality designer pieces, so they are great for makeovers like this one. This dresser is obviously already painted in some white latex. It's adhered pretty well, but it has that classic orange peel texture from being rolled on and just an unappealing plastic feel. As always, this makeover is going to start with removing the hardware and giving everything a really good clean. And as I pulled the drawers out of the dresser, I laid them out in order and then just used a pencil to label them so that when it's time to put everything back together, I know exactly which drawer goes in which opening. The dovetails on the top drawer had come loose, so I glued them up, popped them back together, and then clamped the drawer to dry. I also checked to make sure that all of the runners and glides were okay. The cleaning process is the perfect time to inspect for all of these little things that could turn into big issues down the road. At this point, I thought I was going to be able to sand that orange peel texture off of the latex and apply my new paint right over top, but that isn't quite how it worked out. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have washed the outside of this piece first, but we'll get there in a second. Once my piece was dry, I pulled out my Ryobi 5-inch Orbital sander with some 180 grit sandpaper. And since the paint was stuck on really well, I thought I could avoid stripping it. But this is a pretty classic issue with latex. When you sand it, it melts and makes all of these little balls of paint that then melts back into the surrounding paint, and it's just a mess. At this point, I knew that if I wanted to lose the orange peel and get a smooth finish with my paint, I needed to lose this latex paint with a chemical stripper. I also went ahead and unscrewed the legs. They're just so much easier to deal with when they are not attached to the rest of the dresser. I gloved up and also put on my mask and some safety goggles. And then I used a disposable chip brush to spread out a thick layer of paint stripper all over the paint. It started to bubble up and crackle right away. And then after waiting 15 minutes, I used a metal putty knife to scrape the paint away. I did end up needing to do 2 passes on each surface with my stripper to get all of the paint off. And then I used some mineral spirits on some 4.0 steel wool to clean up any residue that was left behind. I had to wait for everything to dry out again after the mineral spirits, and then I came back with my sander to get off any stubborn paint spots and smooth everything out. I could see from the previous white paint finish that the drawers were actually rubbing on each other when you pulled them open. So I used some 80 grit sandpaper to grind down the top and bottom edge of each of the drawers to give them just a tiny bit more room, a millimeter or two, to slide in and out without hitting each other. Since most of the body of this dresser is now bare MDF, I definitely need to seal it with some primer to make sure that it doesn't swell, especially while I'm applying a water-based paint. So I'm using my typical bin shellac based primer. I find it easiest to apply this with a roller, and the primer sands down super smooth into a fine dust without creating those little balls of paint like the latex does, so I can totally get away with a roller here. My primer was dry in about 30 minutes, so I switched out my sandpaper to some 240 grit, again just to smooth out that roller texture, and then I used some compressed air to dust it off and get it ready for paint. I decided to paint the body in this linen color by House and Canvas. I poured about 400 cc's into the hopper of my gravity-fed HVLP pneumatic spray gun, and then added about 100 cc's of distilled water to thin it out. I usually just eyeball when I'm adding paint and water, and then I shake the mixture up right inside my gun. I sprayed 2 coats of paint, waiting about an hour in between, and after my first coat was dry, I went over it very lightly with that 240 grit sandpaper just to make sure it was super smooth. And just for reference, to spray the body of this dresser, I used about 2/3 of a pint of my watered down paint. Day 1 of this flip was all about the body of the dresser, and day 2 is all about those drawers. My original inspiration piece from Anthropologie has the wooden fish scales all the way down the entire front of the dresser, and that's a lot. It's a little too busy for my own personal design taste, and quite frankly, that would take forever to recreate. So I went ahead and painted the bottom 3 drawers of my dresser to match the body, and I'm gonna be keeping those wooden fish scales just on the top drawer as a fun feature. I use my Cricut machine all the time to print and cut out cool birthday cards, make labels for all of the kids' school supplies, and I've also used it to cut a whole bunch of different custom stencils for furniture flips in the past. But did you know that the Maker 3 can also cut wood? I'm gonna be using my Cricut machine to cut out some scalloped shapes to create that fish scaled design out of real maple veneer. The first step for my project is to create that fish scale shape for the machine to cut out. So on my laptop, I used the basic shapes in the Cricut design space to create this strip of scales. And then I copied it 6 times, which should be enough to fill up 1 sheet of veneer. I'm gonna need to cut out quite a lot of these to cover that drawer. Next, I clicked the Make It button, and the program asked me how I'd like to make my cuts. Cricut suggests cutting their veneer on a strong grip mat, so that's what I chose, and the design space automatically laid it out to fit. Next, I clicked the Customize button to tell my Cricut what kind of material I needed to cut. There is a huge drop-down menu with over 300 different materials that this machine can cut. Everything from crepe paper to fabric and leather, but I'm cutting wood veneer, so that's what I chose here. Then I was instructed to change the standard blade, which comes in the machine, to a deep point blade. And this is so easy to do. You just switch open the B clamp, remove the standard blade, insert the new deep point blade, and then switch it closed again. There's even this handy little spot to keep all of your accessories organized. Next, I laid a sheet of the veneer onto my purple strong grip mat. The back of the veneer package also recommends adding some tape around the edges to keep everything secure for cutting. I loaded my mat into the machine, and when the start button started flashing, I pressed it and off it went. Once the machine was done cutting the 6 strips of scallops, that's a tongue twister, I carefully weeded out the excess material, and then I used this little spatula tool to peel the shapes up off of the mat. After that, it was just a matter of reloading everything and repeating the process until I had enough pieces to cover my drawer. This veneer comes in packages of 2 12 by 12 inch sheets, and I ended up using a total of 3 packages or 6 sheets to cut enough of these to cover my drawer front. Once I had all of my strips cut out, I used some Aileen's clear tacky glue to start sticking them down. I used some of the excess veneer pieces to cover up that first little strip so that there wouldn't be any of the drawer exposed underneath my first layer of scallops. And then I just started applying the scales. I wanted to keep the majority of the glue up at the top of the strip so that it didn't end up squishing out the bottom. And I also made sure to stagger them in kind of a brick pattern to get that fish scale effect. Whenever I got to the edge of the drawer, it was easy to cut off the excess in a straight line with some scissors, but I will come back and clean up these edges a little bit more with my sander once all of the glue's dry. After I had the drawer completely covered, I definitely needed to weigh the veneer down so that it could dry nice and flat. So I just put a little piece of parchment paper over the veneer and then weighed it down with some books. While I waited for the scales to set up, I brought the body of the dresser inside and reattached the legs. Then I stood it up and sealed my paint with some of House & Canvas's flat finish top coat. I poured a little bit out into a separate container and then used a damp applicator sponge to wipe the varnish over the paint. I ended up applying 2 coats, which is going to provide a little bit of extra protection for this dresser, but still keep this nice matte paint finish. I really wanted to keep those original knobs on the bottom drawers of the dresser, but I needed to replace the pull on the top so that it didn't interfere with my new design and so that it more closely matched the look of my inspiration dresser. This over the top handle is from Amazon, and I'll leave it linked down below. I gave all of the hardware a really quick rub down with a medium grit sanding pad, and then I sprayed a few coats of Rustoleum Pure Gold to make them all match. By then the glue on the drawer was nice and dry, so I used my scissors to cut away as much of the excess veneer as I could, and then I took it back out to the garage and used my sander with some 220 grit sandpaper to really carefully grind away the rest of the excess veneer. To get rid of some of the orange undertones in the maple and tie it in with the rest of the dresser a little bit more, I decided to do a really light wash with some watered down linen paint. I soaked my brush in some water and then dipped just a tiny bit of paint and brushed that across the surface. Then I let that dry and brought it inside and decided it needed a little more depth, so I grabbed a lighter color from House & Canvas called Sandstone, which is just barely off-white. And this time with a dry brush, dipped just the tip of my brush into the paint and lightly brushed that back and forth over those scales. It really helps just accentuate the texture and give a lot more depth to the look. I centered my new pole on the top drawer and screwed it in place, and I also replaced all of the knobs on the bottom drawers and then put everything back together. And here it is. This is my interpretation of Anthropologie's Pisces dresser. I think if I were to attempt this project again, I would be a little more careful about making sure that the edges of my shapes were glued down really well, but also that I didn't have any glue squeezing out under the shapes. I think that's a little bit of a fine balance, and I definitely have a few of these scallops that are going to need a little extra dot of glue. But all in all, this project was so easy with the help of my Cricut. I hope that you found some inspiration in this makeover and you're able to look at some of your own furniture pieces a little bit differently. As always, please make sure to subscribe before you go. Leave me a thumbs up and a comment down below, and I will catch you guys next time.